For the longest time playing this game, I did not care about accessibility in the slightest, nor did I think about it at all. However, I've come to think about it a lot more in recent times, seeing as the community at large seems to care more about making their levels accessible nowadays than they used to, and how those attempts at accessibility actually play out in practice says a lot about what accessibility means to us. This is mostly something easy levels are really concerned with, but with the release of Every End, we're also seeing Extreme Demons explore this concept more deeply. I'll definitely talk about that level a bit later, but first let's get situated with what I'm actually talking about here. To be honest, I have mixed feelings about accessibility as a concept, at least when it comes to video games, especially if the game in question is meant to challenge you, because a lot of the time when we in the GD community talk about accessibility, we aren't really talking about something like a colorblind mode, a feature that has no real downsides. Usually, we're talking about difficulty. I'm guessing the reason this shift happened is because accessibility features are pretty widely accepted and uncontroversial anyway at this point, and in a game like Geometry Dash, the first point of friction for most players is going to be difficulty. Therefore, accessibility and difficulty appear to be intertwined. With this in mind, when I think about accessibility a bit more deeply, I inevitably always think about Celeste. Celeste features an assist mode, which lets you customize your gameplay experience in all kinds of ways. It's intended for players who find the game a bit too punishing, helping them along a little. You can slow the game down a little bit if you're finding it difficult to keep up, or you can straight up just skip every level if you really want. It allows the player to customize the game's challenge completely to their own liking. I think I do not like this. If you haven't played Celeste yet, here's your spoiler warning. How's that for accessibility? By the way, don't worry, that's not the final chapter of Celeste in the background. That's just Coaster Mountain by Serpunge. Jokes aside, you should totally play it if you haven't. It's a great game. Anyway, about assist mode. Celeste is a game about facing your inner demons. It's a game where you're constantly running away from yourself and fighting yourself and your doubts, your fears, your anxiety. It's a journey of self-acceptance with plenty of pitfalls and stumbling points, and this is reflected in the gameplay. Celeste is not easy. It takes a lot of determination to keep getting back up every time you fall, to keep pushing forward despite how difficult it might seem on the outset, and to not give in to frustration or depression. Madeline goes through a lot over the course of this game. She gets hopelessly distraught. She gets panic attacks. She wants to give up and go home and bury her face in her pillow on several occasions. But despite all of her hardships, with the support of her newfound friends, she's able to make peace with her darker half and push through to reach for the summit. Madeline's journey is a taxing struggle. It takes a lot out of her, and it pushes her to her breaking point. I don't really like the idea of the player choosing to smooth over the whole experience while Madeline is struggling so hard. I think the whole point of the game is that you're struggling alongside her. You're scaling this mountain together, and that means facing difficulties that might frustrate you. But overcoming that with her may inspire you to scale your own mountain. One moment that really cemented this viewpoint for me in retrospect is at the very end of the game's final chapter, Farewell. Farewell is an incredibly long chapter with some of the hardest challenges the game has to offer. In it, Madeline has to cope with the emotional gut punch that is the loss of a loved one, that being the old woman she came to meet when she first scaled Mount Celeste. After hours and hours of struggling your way through, at the very end, a single remaining room stands in your way. The final room of Farewell is probably the most intimidating challenge of the game. It is a massive gauntlet of jellyfish platforming, crossing vast windy gaps, and finagling your way through tight corridors, precariously maneuvering around explosive pufferfish with no checkpoints in sight. You are meant to die a lot here. You will die a lot here. It's a challenge you are meant to overcome in the end, though. If you die a bunch of times in this room, Madeline's alter ego will pop out to give her some heartfelt words of encouragement. I will never forget this little moment. It's such a small gesture, but the impact it had on me was massive. It's just the little push Madeline needs to keep going, coming from a part of herself she tried so hard to reject before. She's grown so much over the course of this game, and it's so fucking good at making you want her to succeed. You just can't have storytelling like this in a game that's easy. If you don't struggle alongside Madeline, the game's story loses its luster. After all, it's not easy to come to terms with your own fears and anxieties, and it's definitely not easy to come to terms with the death of a loved one. The game is hard because these things in real life are hard. This is why I always have reservations in the back of my mind when we talk about accessibility. Of course, I think it's important that we think carefully about all demographics that would like to play video games, but an accessibility feature like this will fundamentally change the game, and that's something to be wary about. Of course, assist mode is just an optional feature at the end of the day, but should the player really have the freedom to opt out of the game's challenge if they so wish? After all, Madeline doesn't get to opt out of her panic attacks. She doesn't get to opt out of her anxiety, nor does she get to opt out of being trans. All of these things she has to come to terms with and live with. But you, the player, do always have that option. It just feels unfair to her for her to have to struggle with these things while you can just lower the difficulty at the first sign of resistance. It creates a disconnect between the player and Madeline as a character. None of this is to say that I think Celeste is a bad game, mind you. In fact, it's exactly because I think it's such a great game that a small flaw like this stands out to me. I fucking love this game, and that's why I'm still thinking about it. So, how does this relate to Geometry Dash and Every End? It's not like Geometry Dash is a game with an overarching plot, after all. Making the game more accessible by making it easier can't hurt the game's narrative or characters. It's just pure platforming, right? Well, I don't think it's that straightforward. Sure, there is no overarching plotline. I mean, unless you count the tenuous lore behind the demon in the vault. But the game and its community still create expectations. Playing through the main levels gives you an idea of what the gameplay in Geometry Dash will be like, and what it expects from you as a player. Timing, persistence, practice, and keeping a cool head are all things that are required to play this game. On top of that, we as a community weave grand fantastical narratives about our best players overcoming the impossible and pushing against the limits of what is humanly feasible in this game. People can reasonably expect to be challenged when they play a Geometry Dash level, even if it is a relatively easy one. But this is something often forgotten in the name of accessibility. In fact, I think people often misunderstand what makes a level accessible to begin with. Take something like Abducted, for example. This level is designed to be very easy, so you could perhaps reasonably argue that it's accessible to a wide audience. It is true, after all, that most people can probably get through this level with little issue. However, accessibility and difficulty don't mean the same thing, and the two should not be confused. I don't think Abducted is a very accessible level at all, and I'll explain why. Since Geometry Dash is a challenging game by design, I think what we as a community are primarily concerned with when we talk about accessibility is how easy it is for new players to get into our game. I think a lot of gameplay design decisions creators make have a lot to do with trying to accommodate those people. And if you look at it from that perspective, things like invisible objects that guide your path, jump indicators, and prevalent auto parts start to make a lot of sense. On top of that, these kinds of gameplay decisions also appeal to star grinders because it allows them to think less and just go with the flow of the level as they coast to the end. This is why they've become so prevalent and stuck around for so long. Abducted features all of these gameplay quirks, but none of them really help to make the level more accessible to new players. You see, in my opinion, making a level accessible to new players has a lot less to do with making your level easy and a lot more to do with making it simple. If you take Abducted and Back on Track side by side, there's no doubt in my mind that Back on Track is the more difficult level, but I'd also argue that Back on Track is much more accessible to new players because the gameplay is very easy to parse. It's very easy to tell what is and isn't a platform you can land on. There are very few different game modes and jump ring types to keep track of, and there's no visual clutter to complicate things. On the other hand, in Abducted, it's much less straightforward to tell where you can safely land. It features a lot of distracting effects as well as an inexplicable minigame in the middle of the level, and a lot of parts in this level don't even matter at all because it will guide you to the next part anyway, no matter what you do. From the perspective of a new player, you could scarcely design a more baffling level if you tried.
So Crash Bandicoot, for example, we'd lay out levels and there'd be 50 jumps in a row you had to make or you couldn't get through the level, and that's clearly not something that anybody can do. So, we have platforming, but we've de-emphasized jumps within that context.
Out of all of the solutions creators have devised in an attempt to make their levels more accessible, the jump indicator is the most pernicious. The thing that makes jump indicators so prevalent is that on the surface it just seems like good game design. It makes levels easier to parse after all, and it gives newer players something to look out for, smoothing over a lot of the trial and error. However, I think this is another case of a feature that is meant to make your level more accessible while it actually fundamentally changes the gameplay, like we discussed in Celeste. You see, the very fact that jump indicators give you a guideline to follow changes the way how you play the level. In a level without jump indicators, you might scan the level for any upcoming obstacles you may need to avoid. But this is completely taken away with the introduction of the indicator. Just wait until your icon overlaps the next jump indicator and press the button. Especially UFO parts are ubiquitously designed like this nowadays, while back in the day you may have had to figure out the pattern yourself. Geometry Dash is a precision platformer first and foremost, of course, but there's also an element of on-the-spot problem solving and reacting to upcoming threats. If you're playing a difficult level, one of the first things you do is play through it in practice and figure out a comfortable route. You get to know the level very closely. You remember what part comes where and what to do exactly as each part comes up, and only then do you work on your execution. Jump indicators completely neuter this process. They make it a lot easier to effortlessly coast through levels with little to no thought, and that makes them a lot less likely to be memorable in the long term. Creators sometimes put in jump indicators because otherwise their gameplay is difficult to understand or frustrating to play, but I'd argue these are fundamental problems with the gameplay that need to be addressed by restructuring the level, not something to be painted over with a band-aid solution. Okay, with all of that said, I think now we're finally ready to talk about every end. To be perfectly honest, when the level was first revealed, I was quite skeptical of what it was trying to accomplish. After all, an accessible extreme demon seems like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? On top of that, this level was announced in 2.1, and it was planned to be verified on, I think, 240 Hz, which in my mind undermined its accessibility towards 60 Hz players. That issue isn't really relevant anymore with the release of 2.2, but the point is that I thought the level was kind of a half-assed idea, to put it straightforwardly. However, I think I've come around on every end now that it's actually out. It helps, of course, that the refresh rate and consistency has been addressed, but it's like I said before, accessibility isn't the same as difficulty, and lowering the difficulty of your level in the name of accessibility fundamentally changes it. The whole point of every end is to be one of the most difficult levels in the game. It wants to be a top demon, while still being playable by as many people as possible. If you lower the difficulty of every end, you defeat the whole point of the level, but even with that restriction, it can still do things that make it more accessible. In fact, I think every end pushes against the limits of what it can do to make itself as accessible as it can. For one, the gameplay is interminably simple. The entire level consists of regular cube jumps, which is something that can't even be said for Stereo Madness. You could reasonably argue that every end is actually a simpler level than Stereo Madness, simply because it doesn't have any other game modes or jump rings or anything of that sort. You don't even need an in-depth understanding of the game's mechanics with all of its little minutiae. As long as you understand the arc of a regular cube jump at regular speed, you should be able to understand understand this entire level. The corner jumps could potentially throw you for a loop, but the way they're introduced in this level serves as a good tutorial. You're thrown into a sequence of perfectly lined up corner jumps straight out of a transition, teaching you exactly how they work and where you have to land to perform them. All you have to do here is hold down the button, and from there on you can try your hand at your own corner jumps. On top of that, every end is visually easy to parse too. It uses only a handful of different basic objects, and the entire level is aligned with the grid, making distances easy to judge. There are a fair share of fake paths in this level, but it's nothing you can't figure out just by looking at it. The design of this level is extremely simple to mirror the gameplay. There are no extravagant effects or transitions, and there are no detailed backgrounds or designs. What you see is what you get. The one thing that is really notable about the level's visual design is this background effect that shows the upcoming obstacles way in advance. It's iconic, of course. It really emphasizes the scale of this level, and it's cleverly out of the way enough that it doesn't interfere with the action. Speaking of scale, that is the final thing every end does to make itself as accessible as possible. This might sound counterintuitive because longer levels are a much greater test of endurance and willpower, but I think this is the only way for every end to achieve the difficulty it does without being completely unplayable to the majority of players. Its length allows the level to spread out its difficulty a little more thinly, which means the individual jumps are going to be a little more doable for the average player. On top of that, the level never asks of you the ability to spam, and the more difficult jumps of the level are usually separated by easier ones, making the whole experience a lot more palatable. My hardest level is Light Travel, a very low-end extreme demon, and I was able to play this level relatively normally in practice mode. On the other hand, I could not get through Solar Flare without frame advance. I literally just cannot play Solar Flare, but I could play every end and make some amount of progress on it, even if the level in its entirety is beyond me. I've grown to respect every end a lot more thinking about it over the last month, and in turn it has reaffirmed my respect for Mindcap as a host. Frankly, I think he's underrated. For as much as this community constantly congratulates itself for innovating and pushing the limits of the Geometry Dash editor, Mindcap is actually the most prime example of this. He's clearly a creative thinker and always looks for ways to think outside of the box. His projects always have a clear vision and goal in mind, and they always set the standard in new and creative ways in the pursuit of achieving said goal. Mindcap has nurtured his talents as a collab host in the long time he's been a member of this community, and his creative exploits are emblematic of the lifeblood of this game. I think if creators truly want their levels to be more accessible to a fresh audience, they could stand to take a few pages out of the book of every end's design philosophy. That's not to say that your level has to look completely basic like this, but it does mean treating it like an actual level in a video game and spending some time thinking about the complexity of the gameplay and how it's presented to the player. Here are my 2 suggestions. First, keep the number of different game modes limited. For new players, it can easily be confusing to constantly switch between different game modes when they haven't had much practice with them yet. Allow them some time to get comfortable, and allow each section of the level to develop more gradually. This doesn't mean you have to make your level boring to play though. It's okay to throw the player a curveball, and it's okay to present them with a challenge. That is the whole appeal of the game, after all. And second, make sure to prioritize visual clarity. It should be easy to follow along with the gameplay as it happens. This means using visually distinct platforms and obstacles with clear edges. It means keeping speeds on the lower side if you can, and holding back on distracting effects and excessive camera motions. This might seem pretty limiting, but depending on how creative you get with it, I think there's a ton of potential design space to explore in this direction. Plenty of examples already exist to prove how versatile you can still make your levels while abiding by these principles. I'm sure some of you have noticed that this advice I'm giving seems to fly in the face of modern level design sensibilities, in particular when it comes to the new 2.2 features. Well, that's not a coincidence, I don't think. I think 2.2 has made it a lot easier for creators to build levels that are visual spectacles first and foremost. But in order to achieve this, the accessibility of the game had to be sacrificed. That doesn't just go for players. players either. It's true, of course, that a new player will have a hard time keeping up with whatever the fuck's happening in Abducted, but think about it from a new creator's perspective as well. The editor is more complicated and in-depth now than ever, and there's not much room for levels that are of smaller scope in this community. If you want to be a successful creator, there is a severely limited number of approaches you can take, or you won't get promoted by RobTop or the big showcase channels. Basically, I'd argue the game is less accessible now than it's ever been, for both aspiring players and creators alike. Yet another reason for me to keep advocating for a renaissance of the Levolution movement and a gameplay-first approach, something that seems like an utterly foreign concept in the current GD landscape. Anyway, that does it for this video. I didn't intend for this to happen, but I ended up talking about Celeste a lot more than expected. Let me know what you think about my insights, and if you'd maybe be interested in seeing me talk about other games too. I was able to link it back to Geometry Dash this time around, but I'm sure that won't always be the case. If you really like my analysis, you could even consider supporting me on Patreon if you want. Speaking of which, special shoutouts to my grandpa demons on Patreon: Belfry Clock, Crone44, Sir Lethbridge Stewart, Ultra Team, Omega Omelette, Viva Dude, Nightlight, and NotGamer101. Thank you so much for your support. And, as always, thank you for watching, everybody. See you later.